Imagine this. You wake up one morning and decide you will no longer answer every phone call that interrupts your peace. You will no longer stay late at work to cover for colleagues who consistently underperform. You will no longer smile and nod when family members dump their emotional chaos into your lap, expecting you to carry burdens that were never yours to bear. You will no longer sacrifice your mental health on the altar of others' convenience. Within days, perhaps even hours, the labels begin to surface. You've changed, they whisper with disappointment dripping from their voices. You're so cold now, they say, as if warmth could only be measured by your willingness to set yourself on fire to keep others comfortable. What happened to the person we used to know? They ask. Mourning not your authentic self, but the version of you that existed solely to serve their needs. If this resonates with your soul, if you've ever been called cold for finally choosing yourself, then what you're about to discover will fundamentally shift how you see every relationship in your life. But I need you to do something first. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because the psychological insights you're about to encounter don't just challenge conventional wisdom, they demolish it entirely. And you'll want to be part of this community that refuses to mistake self-respect for selfishness. But here lies the most unsettling question of our time. What if what we call coldness is actually the first sign of psychological health? What if the moment you stop being endlessly available, endlessly accommodating, endlessly self-sacrificing, you're not becoming heartless, you're finally becoming whole? This is the paradox that haunts millions. In a world that has confused self-destruction with virtue, setting boundaries feels like committing a moral crime. We live in a society that has romanticized emotional martyrdom to such an extent that protecting your own energy is seen as an act of betrayal. The person who says no to unreasonable demands is labeled selfish. The individual who refuses to carry others' emotional baggage is deemed insensitive. The one who chooses their mental health over others' expectations is branded as cold. But what if this entire framework is built on a fundamental lie? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who dared to map the deepest territories of the human psyche, understood something that most of society refuses to acknowledge. The journey toward authentic selfhood inevitably requires disappointing people. The process he called individuation, becoming who you truly are rather than who others need you to be, is not a gentle evolution. It is a psychological revolution that threatens every relationship built on unconscious dependency, emotional fusion, and the silent agreement that your needs matter less than everyone else's comfort. Jung observed that most human connections are not relationships at all. They are unconscious contracts where one person agrees to be the perpetual giver while others take the role of perpetual takers. The giver's worth is measured not by their intrinsic value as a human being, but by their utility as an emotional dumping ground, a problem solver, a source of endless patience and unconditional availability. When someone begins to question this contract, when they start to recognize that their kindness has been mistaken for weakness, their generosity exploited as obligation, something profound and terrifying happens. The entire social ecosystem around them begins to tremble. Because boundaries don't just protect the individual, they expose the emotional immaturity of everyone who benefited from that person's lack of limits. This is why the reaction is so immediate and so vicious. When you set a boundary, you're not just saying no to a request, you're shattering an illusion. You're revealing that what many people called love was actually dependency. What they labeled caring was actually control. What they praised as selflessness was actually a sophisticated form of psychological imprisonment. The most haunting realization comes when you discover that some people in your life were never interested in you as a complete human being. They were only interested in the parts of you that served their needs. Your emotional labor, your constant availability, your willingness to absorb their anxiety, fix their problems, and validate their choices while neglecting your own existence. So we arrive at the great question that will determine the trajectory of your entire life. Are you prepared to be called cold by people who mistake your health for hostility? Are you ready to disappoint those who love you only when you're convenient? Can you bear the weight of being misunderstood by those who refuse to understand that saying no to them means saying yes to yourself? This is where Jung's wisdom becomes not just insightful, but essential. Because the path ahead requires more than just setting boundaries. It demands a complete reimagining of what it means to be human in relationships built on truth rather than transaction. The problem runs far deeper than most people dare to acknowledge. We are living through what Jung would recognize as a collective psychological crisis, an epidemic of emotional fusion masquerading as love, dependency disguised as devotion, and psychological imprisonment marketed as virtue. From the moment we draw our first breath, we are indoctrinated into a sophisticated system of emotional conditioning that teaches us to measure our worth not by our inherent value as human beings, but by our utility to others. The good child is the one who never causes trouble, who absorbs family dysfunction without complaint, who learns to regulate everyone else's emotions while neglecting their own. The loving partner is the one who sacrifices their dreams for someone else's comfort, who swallows their truth to maintain false peace, who disappears piece by piece until only a hollow shell remains. This is what Jung called the tyranny of the collective unconscious, the invisible force that shapes our behavior through unexamined assumptions, inherited beliefs, and social expectations that we've never consciously chosen to accept. We live our entire lives according to scripts written by others, playing roles that were assigned to us before we had the psychological development to refuse them. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer understood this dynamic when he wrote about the hedgehog's dilemma, the painful paradox of human relationships, where we desperately need connection but struggle to find the right distance that provides warmth without causing harm. Most people never learn to navigate this distance. Instead, they collapse into one of two extremes: complete emotional fusion or total withdrawal. Both are forms of psychological immaturity, but society only recognizes one as problematic. Jung saw that the path to authentic relationships required what he termed differentiation, the ability to know where you end and another person begins. This is not coldness, it is clarity. It is the recognition that you cannot love someone fully if you don't know who you are, and you cannot know who you are if your identity is constantly being shaped by others' needs and expectations. The hidden problem is that most of what we call love in our culture is actually a sophisticated form of mutual dependency. Two incomplete people trying to become whole by consuming each other. The person with poor boundaries becomes the perpetual giver, while their partner, family, or friends assume the role of perpetual takers. Neither party grows, neither party individuates. They remain locked in an unconscious dance of codependency that feels familiar but ultimately prevents both individuals from reaching psychological maturity. Friedrich Nietzsche warned of this when he spoke of the herd mentality, the unconscious agreement to suppress individual authenticity in favor of group acceptance. The person who dares to break from this pattern, who begins to assert their individual will and establish healthy boundaries, is immediately seen as a threat to the social order. They are labeled as selfish, cold, or difficult because their psychological health exposes everyone else's immaturity. Viktor Frankl, who survived the horrors of Nazi concentration camps, understood that the greatest human drive is not pleasure or power, but meaning. And meaning cannot be found when you are living someone else's life, when your energy is constantly being drained by others' emotional chaos, when you have no boundaries to protect the sacred space where your authentic self can emerge. The most insidious aspect of this psychological trap is that it disguises itself as virtue. The person who cannot say no is praised for their kindness. The individual who absorbs everyone else's problems is admired for their compassion. The one who sacrifices their own needs for others' convenience is celebrated as selfless. But Jung recognized that this kind of virtue is often a mask for deep psychological wounds, the fear of abandonment, the terror of being truly seen, the desperate need for external validation to fill an internal void. This creates what Jung called a false self, a personality constructed entirely around others' expectations, needs, and demands. The false self knows how to please, how to accommodate, how to disappear when necessary. But it has no idea how to exist as a sovereign individual with inherent worth, legitimate needs, and the right to take up space in the world. What most people don't realize is that living without boundaries doesn't just harm you. It creates a ripple effect of psychological damage that extends far beyond your immediate relationships. You become an unwitting participant in a system of emotional dysfunction that perpetuates itself across generations, cultures, and entire societies. When you consistently operate without healthy limits, you are unconsciously training everyone around you to view you as an emotional resource rather than a complete human being. Your family learns that your time has no value because you never protect it. Your friends discover that your energy is infinitely available because you never say no. Your colleagues realize that your boundaries are negotiable because you consistently sacrifice them for others' convenience. But here's the most devastating part. You are also teaching them that relationships don't require reciprocity, that love doesn't demand mutual respect, and that connection can exist without consideration for both parties' well-being. You are modeling a form of interaction that is fundamentally toxic, even though it masquerades as virtue. Jung understood this as a form of shadow projection. When you refuse to acknowledge your own needs, when you consistently prioritize others at the expense of yourself, you are projecting your disowned power onto them. You make them responsible for your happiness, your sense of worth, your emotional stability. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness in yourself and learned entitlement in others. The cognitive bias known as the sunk cost fallacy keeps you trapped in this pattern. You've invested so much of yourself in being the helpful one, the reliable one, the selfless one, that admitting these roles were psychologically destructive feels like acknowledging that years or decades of your life were wasted. So you double down, giving even more of yourself, hoping that somehow the investment will eventually pay off in genuine connection and mutual respect. But it never does, because relationships built on imbalance are fundamentally unstable. They require one person to continuously diminish themselves to maintain the illusion of harmony. The moment you stop shrinking, the entire dynamic collapses and suddenly you're the villain in everyone else's story. This is where the neurological reality becomes crucial to understand. Every time you say yes when you want to say no, every time you absorb someone else's emotional chaos, every time you sacrifice your needs for others' wants, you are literally rewiring your brain to associate self-neglect with virtue. You are creating neural pathways that make boundary setting feel like a moral violation rather than a psychological necessity. The cultural conditioning runs so deep that most people experience physical symptoms when they attempt to set their first healthy boundaries. Anxiety, guilt, shame, and even panic attacks are common because the nervous system has been trained to interpret self-protection as danger. You've been conditioned to believe that disappointing others is a form of emotional violence, when in reality, it's often the most loving thing you can do. The unseen consequence that haunts most people who finally begin to set boundaries is the discovery of how many relationships in their lives were built on utility rather than genuine connection. When you stop being endlessly available, when you refuse to carry others' emotional burdens, when you prioritize your own mental health, you quickly learn who was interested in you as a person and who was only interested in what you could provide. This revelation can be shattering because it forces you to confront a truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Many of the people who claim to love you were actually feeding off your inability to protect yourself. They weren't celebrating your kindness. They were exploiting your boundaries' dysfunction. They weren't appreciating your generosity. They were taking advantage of your fear of rejection. The most insidious aspect of this dynamic is that it creates what Jung called psychological vampirism relationships, where one person's energy is consistently drained to fuel another person's emotional needs. The vampire doesn't usually realize they're feeding off someone else's life force, and the victim doesn't understand that their exhaustion isn't noble. It's the natural result of being energetically depleted by others who have never learned to manage their own emotional states. The path to psychological freedom begins with a single revolutionary realization. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotions, solving their problems, or maintaining their comfort at the expense of your own existence. This insight, simple as it sounds, represents nothing less than a complete rebellion against everything society has taught you about relationships, love, and human connection. Jung called this awakening the beginning of individuation, the process by which you stop being a character in everyone else's story and start becoming the author of your own life. But make no mistake, this is not a gentle evolution. This is psychological warfare against every force that has trained you to believe your worth is determined by your usefulness to others. The first act of rebellion is learning to distinguish between your authentic feelings and the emotions you've absorbed from others. Most people who struggle with boundaries have spent so many years carrying other people's anxiety, depression, anger, and fear that they no longer know which feelings actually belong to them. You must begin the painstaking process of emotional archaeology, digging through layers of internalized guilt, inherited shame, and projected expectations to uncover your actual self beneath the rubble. This requires what Jung termed shadow work, the courage to examine the parts of yourself you've been taught to hide or deny. The shadow contains not just your repressed negative traits, but also your disowned power, your unacknowledged needs, your authentic desires that were deemed unacceptable by others. When you reclaim your shadow, you reclaim your right to exist as a complete human being rather than a partial person designed to serve others' needs. The second rebellion involves questioning every relationship in your life through a new lens. Instead of asking, "How can I make this person happy?" or "What do they need from me?" you must learn to ask, "Is this relationship based on mutual respect or unconscious exploitation? And do they value me as a person, or do they only appreciate what I provide?" These questions will reveal uncomfortable truths, but they are necessary for psychological liberation. You will discover that some people in your life have never seen you as anything more than a function: the friend who listens without being heard, the family member who gives without receiving, the partner who adapts without being accepted for who they truly are. This recognition is devastating but essential because it frees you from the exhausting performance of trying to earn love from people who were never capable of offering it authentically. The third act of rebellion is learning to communicate boundaries without justifying, explaining, or apologizing for your basic human needs. Most people who are new to boundary setting make the mistake of over-explaining their decisions as if they need to convince others that their needs are legitimate. But healthy boundaries don't require external validation. They are unilateral decisions about how you will and will not allow yourself to be treated. This means saying, "No, I won't be available for that," without following it with a lengthy explanation about why your time matters. It means stating, "I don't discuss my personal decisions with people who can't respect them," without feeling obligated to justify your right to privacy. It means declaring, "I won't continue conversations that involve yelling or personal attacks," without apologizing for refusing to accept abuse. The most counterintuitive aspect of this rebellion is that it often requires you to disappoint people in order to respect them. When you stop enabling someone's emotional immaturity by constantly rescuing them from the consequences of their choices, you are giving them the opportunity to grow. When you refuse to participate in toxic family dynamics, you are modeling what healthy relationships actually look like. When you prioritize your own mental health, you are demonstrating that self-respect is not selfish, it's essential. History is full of individuals who chose psychological authenticity over social acceptance. Gandhi refused to conform to British expectations of how colonized people should behave. Rosa Parks declined to accept her assigned place in a system that demanded her diminishment. These were not acts of coldness, they were acts of profound courage that challenged entire systems of oppression by refusing to participate in their own dehumanization. Here lies the truth that will either liberate you or haunt you for the rest of your life. You were never actually cold. You were finally becoming warm, but only to yourself. Every moment you spent doubting your decision to set boundaries, every pang of guilt you felt for prioritizing your mental health, every accusation of coldness that made you question your worth, all of it was the death rattle of a false identity that had outlived its purpose. The person who could absorb infinite amounts of dysfunction, who could smile while being emotionally eviscerated, who could love others while abandoning themselves, that person was not your authentic self. That person was a psychological survival mechanism masquerading as virtue. Jung understood that the deepest tragedy of human existence is not that we suffer, but that we suffer while pretending we don't. We become so skilled at managing everyone else's emotional reality that we lose touch with our own. We become so adept at reading others' needs that we forget we have any. We become so proficient at being what others require that we have no idea who we actually are when no one is watching, needing, or demanding anything from us. The ultimate realization is this: what you thought was love was often fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being seen as selfish, difficult, or unworthy. You learn to love others by hating yourself, to care for them by neglecting your own existence, to maintain connection by disconnecting from your authentic needs and desires. This is not love. This is a sophisticated form of self-violence disguised as compassion. True love, Jung realized, can only emerge between two individuated beings, people who know themselves deeply enough to know where they end and others begin. There can be no authentic intimacy without clear boundaries, because intimacy requires the presence of two complete individuals choosing to share their wholeness not two wounded people trying to heal each other through psychological fusion. When you set boundaries, you are not building walls to keep others out. You are constructing windows that allow others to see you clearly for the first time. The people who call you cold are revealing their inability to love someone who refuses to be consumed by their needs. They are demonstrating that their affection was conditional on your self-abandonment, their care dependent on your convenience, their connection contingent on your willingness to disappear. This realization reshapes everything. Every relationship that crumbles under the weight of your healthy boundaries was built on an unstable foundation of unconscious exploitation. Every person who withdraws their affection when you stop overgiving was never offering authentic love in the first place. Every accusation of coldness is actually a confession of emotional immaturity from someone who cannot distinguish between love and utility. The most profound shift occurs when you realize that your boundaries are not punishment, they are invitations. You are inviting others to meet you in a space of mutual respect rather than unconscious consumption. You are inviting authentic connection rather than codependent fusion. You are inviting people to love the real you rather than the performance you used to provide for their comfort. Some will accept this invitation and discover that relationships based on clarity are infinitely more fulfilling than those based on confusion. They will realize that being loved for who you are is more nourishing than being needed for what you provide. They will understand that true intimacy requires space for both people to exist fully rather than one person eclipsing themselves for the other's convenience. Others will reject this invitation because it requires them to do the psychological work they have been avoiding. It demands that they develop their own emotional regulation skills instead of outsourcing that responsibility to you. It requires them to face their own inner emptiness instead of filling it with your energy. These people will walk away, and you must let them go, not because you don't care about them, but because you finally care enough about yourself to refuse relationships that require your diminishment. The final truth that Jung would want you to understand is this: you are not responsible for other people's inability to love you properly. You are not obligated to remain small so others can feel big. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Your psychological health is not a betrayal of those who benefit from your dysfunction. It is a gift to those who are ready to meet you in authentic relationship. The moment you stop being cold to yourself and start being warm to your own needs, desires, and boundaries, you discover something magnificent. The right people don't disappear when you become whole. They appear. Because wholeness calls to wholeness. Authenticity attracts authenticity. And people who have done their own inner work recognize and celebrate others who have had the courage to do the same. You are not cold. You are finally, beautifully, courageously warm to the person who needed your warmth most. Yourself. And from that place of self-respect, you can offer others something far more valuable than endless accommodation. You can offer them the example of what it looks like to live as a complete human being who knows their worth, protects their energy, and chooses their connections consciously rather than compulsively. This is not coldness. This is freedom. This is not selfishness. This is wholeness. This is not rejection. This is the highest form of love, love that includes you.